ended up out in the US working on a project, trying to communicate the benefits of clean energy to conservatives. I mean, it sounds sort of mission impossible and lunacy
yeah.
and lunacy at every level. But you know, the thinking was, look, clean energy has, you know, a number of things in its favor. First of all, the economics. But secondly, you know, it's better from a kind of national security or an energy security standpoint. So yeah. A more resilient system. You know, it's better for human health. I mean, all kinds of other benefits, as well, of course, the environmental benefits that come with clean energy. And yet, environmentalists were only playing that one card. You know, the climate card. We were just banging on about, you know, how doomed we were and how you know, climate change was just a mortal threat, and somehow clean energy and climate change got conflated. And certainly in the States, it became a very kind of polarizing discussion, a very polarizing debate. And so we worked on this project, really trying to work out how to communicate better the benefits of clean energy, essentially without mentioning climate change. And we hired this guy, Frank Luntz, Frank's the guy who actually coined the phrase climate change, working for, I think he was working for the fossil fuel industry back in the early 2000s. He changed it from global warming, but he's a wordsmith, and he understands what words and what messages resonate with conservative audiences. And we hired him, and he came back and said, look, you know, climate change is toxic. You know, after he ran a number of focus groups, he said, you know, to conservatives, it just shuts them up. They just don't want to engage. But you know, you talk about national security and you talk about economic benefits, then you get huge support. And as part of that, we started trying to develop and find messengers, you know, Republican messengers who could deliver these sorts of messages. And I met with everyone from kind of the Christian Coalition through to the Farmers Union and all kinds of other groups, and a couple of founders of the Tea Party, and ended up speaking to the military in various different guises. And as part of that relationship, I got invited along to a scenario planning exercise that the US military were doing. I think they invited me because I was one of the only people they could find who could kind of give them a kind of counter point of view. And they were looking at a scenario. They're asking the question of, if we have a more rapid energy transition than we're forecasting, what will that mean for geopolitics? And they invited along, you know, 10 experts. They had, you know, the IEA there. They had, you know, some consultants, some oil companies, departments of state, and so on and so forth. And you know, we each got 20 minutes to deliver our case, and eight of the 10, you know, groups who were invited had pretty much identical forecasts for the adoption of solar PV and the adoption of electric vehicles. And they were these kind of low linear forecasts out literally 2040 or 2050 of kind of incremental adoption, you know, maybe 10 or even 20% in the most aggressive forecasts adoption by that kind of mid-century point. And this guy, Tony Sieber, got up in the middle of it all. When it was his turn, he said, look, you know, that's not how technology disruptions work. They're not these slow incremental progressions. They're rapid, they're non-linear, they're S-curves. And these things are over by the 2030s. And, you know, if you're making your plans based on these faulty forecasts, you're going to make some major mistakes. And, you know, I basically got up and said, look, you know, I agree with Tony. and anyway, the two of us went out for coffee afterwards, and we spoke for months. You know, and basically we were kind of just astounded that, you know, $1 trillion a year organization, the US military, just had no idea how to forecast, no idea to see, you know, what was coming, and were trapped in that kind of linear, you know, reductive mindset that just kind of extrapolates the kind of, you know, data today. And yeah, we were talking about everything from, you know, education through to, you know, food and agriculture, through to geopolitics and climate change. And, you know, in all those areas, you know, having better expectation of what's coming is hugely important, because without it, you can't possibly take decisions. And so, you know, eventually we decided we had no choice but to set up an organization that could provide better analysis. So Rethink X is a not-for-profit research group. And what we're doing essentially is applying this complex systems framework we've developed to individual sectors of the economy and society more broadly, to try and understand, you know, what might be coming and what we might be able, what choices are opening up to us so that decision makers can take better decisions. And that's really the background.
That's a brilliant background. There's lots of that I know we're going to dig into later, the comms bit. And I know that several people on this call are big on systems and complex systems. So I'm expecting questions from them. Adam Lusby, I'm looking at you in particular. And so you started that. You've done some brilliant sector reports. I think the first one I picked up was the car industry one, but then there's also energy, there's food. Your colleague Catherine did a fantastic presentation for us in 2020 on that disruption. Really quite sector specific and quite technical. A couple of questions I have on that. So one was just how do you start? Are you still doing analysis? Do you have hundreds of researchers building this? How do you start crafting that? Because I think that's really interesting. It's unlike any of the other books we've had, which has been one author kind of writing prose, I guess, to convince us.
Yeah, so I mean, we started with these sector reports. We actually wanted to write Rethinking Humanity right at the outset. That was the big, but we felt that it would just be meaningless without showing, at least at a sector level, how profoundly the economy, a particular sector of the economy might be changing, so we could then make the arguments about society. So I mean, we've developed this framework which really builds on the work Tony had done in various books he published previously, and he'd been teaching technology disruption at Stanford for a decade or so before I met him, and we really apply that framework to individual sectors. So what we're essentially, it's a complex system, but you have to kind of unroll it and unfold it somehow and start somewhere. So we start with cost curves. I mean, that's the starting point. We look at a number of different technologies, understand, how they improve in cost, but also how their capabilities improve. And we speak to everyone we possibly can, and we look at, past history, and we understand, how these learning curves, work essentially. And then we try and understand the processes of disruption. So in some ways, I think what we're doing is kind of looking below the surface of the noise, the data and the trends that most analysts look at, to the processes that drive disruption. And so, what drives that S curve really is this, is that, in the kind of the long periods of incremental change, the past 100 years for, our energy system or our transport system, the system's really in equilibrium, and it's held there by, what's known as negative feedback loops we call brakes. They're things that act to constrain change and keep us in a kind of steady state. And they dominate, and everything kind of, carries on as normal. But you get to a certain point, and it's the same in any complex system. We see it in the climate system as well, where you reach a threshold or a tipping point where the brakes begin to weaken, and these accelerating forces that drive change begin to kick in and dominate. And those accelerating forces are both a virtuous cycle for new technology. The idea that you get, decreasing cost leads to increasing demand, leads to increasing economies of scale, leads consumers to public opinion to shift, and regulation to shift, and more investment floods into a sector, and so on and so forth. And that drives this kind of cascade of improvement for the new. But the old industry, suffers from a vicious cycle, a death spiral of decreasing demand, rising costs, reducing economies of scale, less investment, so on and so forth, that leads to the sort of collapse of the existing sector. And so we model those feedback loops, and that's what gives us that S curve, that non-linear kind of adoption trajectory. But also, it's important to remember that what emerges, the system that emerges out the other side is an entirely new system. We call it a phase change. It's not just a car, for instance, replacing a horse. It's not just a technology substitution. It's a whole new set of possibilities and relationships, and so it's important to understand how fundamentally the system can shift. And a lot of what we term linear analysis fails to kind of consider how fundamentally, a system can shift. When the horse came along, so when the horse got disrupted by the car, for instance, it changed not just the transport system, but it transformed agriculture and retail, and where we built our homes and offices and so on and so forth. And so that, that's understanding the feedback loops is really important, as is understanding the kind of cascading consequences of change. How it affects every part of society. So that's how we build these.
That's really that's really interesting. And I can see there's a question, but because one of the things I actually, when I reread it with a view to this, to having this conversation, I had my teenage daughter read the small section on how the smartphone led to the fossil fuel, or had consequences for our use of fossil fuels, because it just seemed like a really good opening. She's very attached to her smartphone, and that sense of having feedback loops and starting to understand feedback loops and consequences for something that feels vaguely relevant to you is quite a good entry point into all this. I would suggest.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, complex systems are pretty dry, and it's pretty, we were trying to write Rethinking Humanity to be accessible to a kind of broader audience rather than just a kind of purely academic or technical audience. And so, I think these processes are best illustrated through example. I mean, I think it's the only way to make it at least somewhat engaging. I mean, it's still a kind of quite a dense read, but it's and I think what we're trying to show there is look, there are different levels of society as well. You can have a disruption that operates at just a sector level, can transform, say the transport sector or one small part of society. But you get these other disruptions that converge, and with disruptions that in other sectors of the economy, and they can transform the whole of society. Not just our production system, but actually the way we organize ourselves and the way we govern ourselves.
No, I want to come back to that. I want to come to the questions, but just my standard opening question, and I will just ask, so if you were going to summarize the message of this book in one go before we pick up on John's and David's questions, and here comes the dog, then would you just, what are the key tenets that you'd like anybody who comes into contact with the book take away? I know you've said, I'm assuming some of it you've just covered, but I'm assuming there's something about optimism there.
There's certainly tempered optimism in the book, but really, and this has come, partly as a result of writing the book, but also since we published the book, is a belief that ultimately our mindset is key to determining our future. That we have a mindset that really kind of developed through the scientific revolution. I mean, it's a sort of reductive, deterministic mindset that it's really a simple systems mindset in some ways. We're very good at understanding the individual parts of the system, but very bad at understanding the kind of the interconnections and the interactions of the pieces. And I think that applies to every part of society, whether it's academia, the individual kind of subjects and departments we have, or governments, the way we organize ourselves around individual kind of domains of society, or whatever it might be, different sectors of the economy as kind of industries or investors, that we just we fail to understand that those kinds of interconnections. And I think that failure is fine when you're in one of these equilibrium phases that we talked about previously, where things aren't changing. You can kind of extrapolate the past into the future. It's not a bad approximation for the future. But when you come to a period of transformation, it's just wholly inadequate. Once you come out of it, once the system's pushed out of equilibrium, change is going to happen, and it's going to happen rapidly. And I think that for me is really the key insight, that understanding of complexity and is critical to understanding the possibilities that we look as we look forward. So climate change is a great example. If we don't see the possibilities that are emerging, certainly technologically or within the economy, then we reach for one kind of toolkit, And, in that toolkit, it's kind of the all of the above approach. It's what Tony calls the kind of whack-a-mole approach.
Yeah.
We need regulation, we need tax, we need subsidy, we need behavior change. We need to kind of do everything and hit it really hard. But, in that world, what you're essentially doing is trying to push the boulder up the hill. Right, you've got, it's an almost impossible task. It's when the market forces aren't in your favor, when market forces are kind of headwind, solving climate change through that approach is just really, really difficult, as we found. And that's where the mindset is for most of society today. But when you realize what's possible, and you see that market forces are actually going to be a tailwind over the next decade or two, it's really like pushing the boulder down the hill. And what you're trying to do is keep the boulder on track and trying to make sure it doesn't do too much collateral damage or roll off down a blind alley. But you've basically got a much easier job of kind of easing its path and accelerating it. And I think, that's really important to understand, whatever subject we're thinking about, whether it's climate change or it's social issues or it's geopolitics or it's investment or any kind of government, we need to fully understand, the possibilities that are emerging for us to be able to kind of plot our way forward, and that for me is a kind of critical piece.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to jump to it because John's question refers to this idea of the below the surface and the noise. As you jumped into that, were there conclusions of that work that jolted you, or is it the case that you have a model, you crank the handle, you can kind of get a semi-predictable set of adoption curves coming forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I always refer to it as a kind of combination of art and science. I mean, I'd be lying if I said, the model kind of dictates everything. I mean, you're certainly where we are now, we are very much finessing that model. But those cost curves, they can hold for a very long period of time. And I think when you see as technologies come down in cost and improving capability, they disrupt different markets along the way. I mean, you see it in the electric car market, they start in the luxury market and gradually they're opening up more and more. But they also create entirely new possibilities that didn't exist, before in the old model, and those cost curves actually hold for remarkably long periods of time. I mean, if you were to go back to 1975 or so and try and speculate how computer processing might improve, by a factor of billions over the course of the next few decades, you'd have no idea. You just wouldn't be able to. You just wouldn't be able to possibly anticipate, the kind of scale of improvement and how things fundamentally changed in that market, and also the opportunities and the possibilities that would.
It reminds me. I was, and I don't even know what year it was. At some point, I was in the tech industry, and there was this debate going on. It must have been late 90s probably, of was the computer, the phone, or the television going to win as the thing? And of course, when I look at it now, I go, well, hardware didn't win at all. The software won, and it's the platforms, but yet none of it, and the kind of quite big companies were all just fixated on the physical thing, and yet you see us now sort of the hardware makes almost no difference to how we're functioning, especially the younger generation, but it's all about what software you've got and the apps that take you forward, right? And we couldn't have predicted that.
No, I think that's right, and I think that's a broader trend. I mean, I think ultimately what we're saying, if we think of the world as made up of matter, energy, and information, I think what we're ultimately saying is, over the next couple of decades, we're going to see a disruption of matter and energy by information.
Yeah.
And so what I mean by that is we're in what we term a kind of extractive economy right now, extractive production system, where we harness matter, energy, and information from essentially at a global scale now, and those things flow through our system, globally, and what the system we're moving to is one where the production of matter and energy happen much, much more locally. And we're essentially exchanging just the information. So what we'll have is a system where there are, there were massive physical flows through the system, matter and energy. And we're going to a system where there are at least, on a global basis, very, very limited physical flows, but massive information flows. I mean, in the food system, for instance, we'll be concocting kind of molecular recipes or recipes for proteins and so on, and exchanging those globally, but the production will happen, in a modularized and localized way. And that's really the trend. And I think, we've seen that happening over the last decade or two to some degree, but it's going to be on steroids over the next couple of decades. But that raises all kinds of questions, because when you move into an information-based system, we talk about we use the term organizing system to describe kind of governance structures and institutions. And if you try and kind of run our, the emerging production system through that kind of industrial organizing system, that's where you run into some horrible kind of outcomes. And I think that's one of the things that really concerns me is that we end up in this kind of dystopia where, the network effects of information just mean that we just live in this incredibly unequal world if we fail to kind of adapt how we organize ourselves. Sorry, does that make any sense?
It does. I kind of want to dig into that both the dystopia and the risk, but also the opportunity and what do we do about it? Because and you refer to it in the book, we couldn't control the East India Company. Now we can't control Facebook. It feels to me that there's this tension between localizing production and all those things that actually lots of the regenerative thinkers have been talking about for a while, that we must have distributed systems instead of having the globalization. And yet at the same time, you've got this hyper-globalized sense because of information, because of technology, where let's go positive. Instead of saying, where's the dystopia coming from, describe that. What do you think we can do, we should be doing about it, I guess? Haha. $1 million.
It's a really good question, and we don't necessarily have the answers to that. I think in some ways the way we organize society, the way we take decisions, the way we allocate resources, has to mirror the production system to some degree. And that's what we've seen, through history. And so today, we have an industrial extractive economy, very centralized and a big scale, and our governance structures and institutions mirror that. I mean, that's really one of the kind of core theses of the book, is that you have that kind of co-evolutionary process, and the best system, the best adapted system to whatever era and whatever technologies you have kind of wins out and spreads, replicates, and so on. And so that's a system we're in today, and it's the best suited, at least the best suited version that we've seen today to manage that kind of industrial economy. When you move to this, what we term the network and the node, or this much more distributed, kind of connected system, how we manage that, it is likely to be entirely different. And I think that's ultimately the challenge here. Is how do we mirror that distributed network structure in our organizing capabilities? And we see some instances of people trying to do that and trying to create these kind of more empowered and distributed structures, but as yet we're a long way from it, and I think ultimately it's only going to emerge through kind of trial and error. Like for us it's about creating the conditions to enable that system to emerge, rather than kind of sitting in a room and planning. I think the kind of the top-down mechanism is is not just dangerous, but probably the wrong way in which to approach this. That it needs to be a kind of emergent process of trial and probably painful error to
that's what we might see. I will be now the questions are starting to flood in, so I will go to David's asked a question and comment first. Core propositions and overlap with others. So Scott's deep transition, Perez technological revolutions and financial capital, Madeline and Lewis is the human planet, Janeway's doing capitalism and innovation economy, great heritage. What are the strongest arguments against your proposition, and how do you respond to them? Have you had anything that has really felt close to the bone?
We have. I mean, we've had a lot of pushback from certain quarters, and actually, we get a lot of pushback in the environmental space. I mean, that's a kind of part of society where I think we get particular resistance. That it's maybe there's a perception that what we're advocating for is this kind of techno utopia, and that's not the case. I mean, what we're trying to highlight is that we're at this extraordinary period in human history, and the possibilities, both good and bad, are exploding ahead of us, and we need to have our eyes open if we're to navigate the road ahead, and that we might have to think about some things that might seem unpalatable. I think there is, and I'm probably not going to make any friends on this call by saying it, but I do think there's within the environmental movement sometimes a perception that solving climate change is not enough, that we also need to solve for capitalism and some of the more agrarious harms that come with the current system. But for me, that perception is a kind of top-down perception that we need to do something from the top to kind of rework things. And I think what we're saying, and I'm probably going a bit off track here, but bear with me. What we're saying at the core of the argument is, look, we've been in this extractive system, and inherent in that system, and it's been the same for every civilization, through history, where underlying it, when you're in a world of kind of zero-sum competition, competition for scarce resources, inputs into the economy, land, labor, capital, but basically it's resources and people.
Yeah.
When you're in a kind of a zero-sum competition for those, there exists as a sort of underlying driver of human progress, a growth imperative, right? Either you grow or you get outgrown.
Yeah.
Either you exploit or you get exploited. And for us, that's the underlying driver of the pattern of history, that societies that have either tried to live sustainably or equitably have slowed progress, and they've been outcompeted by others, and that's led to that sort of boom and bust cycle where we've grown too far and too fast and gone beyond the kind of the safe operating zone. And then sort of environmental collapse follows, or social collapse, or some other form of collapse. So in some ways, in this kind of system, the exploitation of people and planet is hardwired. I mean, it's the very essence of that system.
What we do, yeah.
Yeah, and so we can tinker with it a bit, right? We can make it a bit more equitable or a bit more sustainable, but we can't fundamentally solve whilst we're in that system, unless we do it at a global scale, because someone else is just going to outcompete us. And I think what we're also saying is, but wait, there's this new system emerging, a new system of production. If we can see what's going on in what we term the foundational sector of the economy, that is fundamentally different. For the first time in the history of civilization, it has a different essence. It's not an extractive economy. We call it a creative economy, but actually, John would call it a regenerative or a generative economy, which I think is actually, a better word. But it's where we start with a single photon or electron or molecule or cell, and the things that we need to build, and provide all the products and services we need are available in abundance pretty much everywhere in the world. And so we're out of that world of scarcity. and into this world of abundance. And it's you know, and in meeting our needs now, we kind of, you know, uncouple. We don't have the same tensions and trade-offs between environmental outcomes, economic outcomes, and social outcomes that you have in an extractive economy. We kind of cut the Gordian knot in some ways by you know, allowing this system to emerge, and so those tensions disappear.
And actually, just fun enough, because I was writing regenerative when I saw creative, when I was kind of making my notes, and yet, as you're just talking, it seems to me that I think that there's this very basic, you know, either you're going to be sustainable by less technology or more technology, and there's been this, I guess, lack of creative thinking to solve the scarcity issue. And I quite like the idea of saying, well, this is a creative system, because, you know, I can think of examples from business, from where when you don't have the resources, that is when you start thinking differently if you have to get something done, and using technology not necessarily for how we've used it in the past, but using it to fundamentally drive this bigger shift. And I can see David being nice and saying, yes, and have there been any strong arguments from people who understand the core proposition rather than kind of misunderstand it as techno-optimism? We'll finish that one off.
Yeah, no, I can finish answering that one. Yeah, I mean, yes, there have been, but they tend to be somewhat specific.
Okay.
To either our individual sector analyses or actually just a comment. And I find it difficult to argue that we're never going to be able to make the scale of adaptation that you're talking about. That it's you know, collapse is inevitable before we can rebuild. That you know, no society is going to transform itself to the scale that you're saying. And maybe that's right. I mean, I don't know. I am hopeful that we will find places. You know, probably not, you know, leaders today, but you know, those who are you know, better suited and better able to radically, you know, reform their societies. I think you know, I think that's my hope.
Yes, I'm with you. Richard is then adding about geographical differences. Have you seen any difference in reception depending on geography?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we've it's weird the way these sorts of things, you know, travel. I mean, you know, we just essentially publish this on our website and, you know, give the book away for free, and it's found kind of strange audiences. I mean, it went viral in India, for instance.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and we had a lot of interest from you know, parts of the Indian government and people out there. It also went viral in kind of a, you know, what I might term a spirituality community. And we had a lot of interest from that part. Now, you know, we can talk later perhaps about, you know, where that might come from, because it doesn't seem.
I would love to talk about that. I've got a little note.
Yeah, a kind of natural bedfellow, but I think actually in the, you know, the developing world where it's reached, I think there has been real interest, because, you know, ultimately I think, you know, one of the key messages we're trying to get across is, look, you know, these technologies enable us not just to solve issues like, you know, climate change, but they're, you know, they allow us to solve a lot of our social issues in tandem together. We don't have to trade off kind of environmental outcomes with social outcomes. So, you know, if you think of energy, for instance, it is, you know, the new energy system, solar, wind, and batteries. It's inherently more equitable than the fossil fuel system we have. And you know, just three quick reasons as to why. You know, one, it's modular, right? So you can scale supply to meet demand. One of the problems we have in the global south, or in, you know, in places where there just isn't a huge amount of demand, and that demand is very distributed. So, you know, the economics of a kind of centralized system where you've got huge costs of transmission and distribution mean that, you know, if you don't have demand, you just can't make money by selling energy. It has to be hugely expensive. So you know, solar allows us to scale supply to demand and get around that problem. And it's also distributed, which you know, those two things together mean that it doesn't require kind of top-down central governance to implement. We don't, all the governance issues we have, and actually, access to capital problems you have in those parts of the world can be kind of, that you can go around them and enable a kind of bottom-up implementation. And that's hugely exciting. But the really big difference, actually, and the really exciting thing about a system, a solar, wind, and battery system, is it's just much more efficient and lower cost in most parts of the world, and it's going to transform the meaning of geography. So we've modeled a solar, wind, and battery system in say Germany and in India and in Brazil, and we find that in India and Brazil, you get a cost of energy at about a fifth of the cost in Germany, mainly because they have better solar resources, but also they don't have the problem of seasonality. And the way we deal with seasonality is to overbuild the system. That'll be the cheapest way to do it. It's not to build massive scale storage and hydrogen and all this other stuff. In our energy paper, we talk about this. We'll build a massive overcapacity to meet the scale to meet demand in winter. And the effect of that will produce an abundance of free energy the rest of the year. Basically zero cost energy, an oversupply that we can use for desalination, water desalination, or food production, or electrifying vehicle. I mean, whatever we might use it for. But that low cost energy is going to turn geography on its head, and those parts of the world will have a huge advantage, given that energy underpins pretty much every other sector.
Everything we do
compared to us in the north.
Yeah, no. And Ran, did that answer your question or your comment? Because I actually Ran's just saying he's heard that it described as having potential to be much more democratic. I'm assuming that covers it. If not, please shout or chat, whichever.
Yeah, it does. I just thought it was a really interesting comment when I first heard it, and suddenly it opens up a whole lot of opportunities which, sitting in the Western country, we just don't think about with our energy system.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's absolutely right. It links slightly to something that I think Kerry put in, which was about the implications, sort of a little bit more specific on internalizing the externalities when you're doing the cost curves. Have you observed anything there? If we were paying for the true value of things, how might that change your cost curves?
Yeah. So I mean, these technologies that we're referring to in the kind of what we term the foundational sector of the economy. Yes. Are clean, essentially. I mean, they come without externalities, certainly to the extent of the industrial alternatives, and so it would only, if we accounted for externalities, it would only accelerate the transformation. I mean, it would essentially bring, either bring down the cost of these technologies or push up the cost of the old, and I think that's so I mean. That's a kind of the role that a carbon tax or any other kind of intervention might play is to do that, to widen the differential. But we're certainly in those three sectors, transport, energy, and food. Over the course of the 2020s, we're going to see a widening gulf between the cost of the clean version and the cost of the kind of industrial extractive version. That will get wider and wider and just accelerate those technologies along the S curve.
And I wanted to, actually, carbon tax sort of triggered something I wanted to talk to you about, which was, you mentioned in the book, and I think I wrote down a little quote around, market forces, in a sense, being allowed to roam and sorting things out. So that's probably not rethinking capitalism, which a lot of our books in this book club actually have been around, ? Is that right? And then, especially in this run up to COP and so on, is where does that leave the role of the government? Is it, are you partly advocating for minimal state intervention, or do you see that maybe in this particular transitional period, we need to have a carbon tax, we need to do certain things?
Yeah. So I mean, let me deal with the first one, market forces and capitalism, or free market capitalism, let's call it, to start with. So in some ways, I think what we're saying is over the next decade or two, we need capitalism to deliver these solutions. Now, we can certainly make capitalism friendlier and less impactful. But once we created, or once we built that new system, capitalism sort of served its purpose, right? We'll have enough of the things we need. And actually, I mean, the next paper I'm writing is on kind of social issues, and one of the chapters there is entitled the Free Market Communist Manifesto, which is is really arguing for the fact that actually we need a totally new kind of system of ownership. I mean, that's really what capitalism is, and a totally different way of allocating resources through the system. And so it's, what we're saying is, in an extractive economy, capitalism is the best thing we have, and we need it to enable that transition, to the investment that's going to drive this growth. But when we get to that new system, actually, a whole host of new possibilities for ownership and allocation resources become possible, and actually probably preferable, and will outcompete capitalism. So that's my answer to that. It's kind of hedging. It's both and, but it's kind of sequential. That capitalism absolutely, or market forces, are the answer over the next decade or two as we roll out that system, with all the appropriate band-aids to make it somewhat better and more tolerable. Yes. But ultimately a new system. Then in terms of government and what's the role of government, certainly in fighting climate change, I think it's incredibly important in setting the ambition and setting the parameters, but ultimately, as I was trying to explain earlier on, this is about technologies that are better and cheaper than the old industrial alternatives, and so market forces are a tailwind, and so that critical in our analysis is to create the conditions in which those new food, energy, transport systems and so on can emerge and grow to scale. So remove all the kind of incumbency, the subsidies that pervert markets, and the power of lobbying and legislation to slow things down, but also to create kind of unhelpful industries. Hydrogen and nuclear are both kind of beloved of the industrial economy. Yes, it's a kind of transition pathway. We don't think they have. I mean, hydrogen will have niche roles to play, but not at the kind of scale that we're talking about. We don't think on economic grounds. And the same with nuclear. That these are being espoused as climate solutions, but they make no economic sense. So, but the problem we have in some ways is we just don't see what's possible in our energy system, in our food system, in our transport system, and so that leads us in that world where we're trying everything. It's Tony, the whack-a-mole approach that Tony talks about, where we use techno fixes to it's kind of funny actually. We've been tracking recently. I always promise to share these with you guys at some point, but we track what we call band-aid solutions, and these are kind of solutions that sort of patch up the old system, try and make it a bit less bad. Yeah, treating symptoms rather than kind of enabling the new system to come through, and so there've been some really funny ones in agriculture, livestock farming. Essentially attempts to make animal farming, livestock farming, a bit less polluting. And so a couple of them. I mean, one of them was these German scientists have potty trained cows. They've taught them to urinate in the same part of the field as babies, and apparently that has an impact on how much emissions those livestock. They also feed them algae, and that has a kind of it means they emit less methane, and it's helpful. It's a band-aid, but it's not a cure, a solution. And you could go on. We have so many examples of these, but the point is, you can spend a lot of time, effort making that system less bad. Yes. Or you can realize that actually we don't need animals to produce the food we need, and by moving to a system that doesn't use animals, we'll have cheaper, more secure, healthier, better environmentally, sources of food that transform, how we meet our need for calories. And so that I think is kind of critical to understand that actually we have this incredible set of possibilities. And most of what we're doing today is about patching up, either through these kind of crazy techno fixes, or through kind of regulation, subsidy, or even behavior change, giving up eating meat or giving up consumption in some form or another. And those are useful. We might need to do those for the next decade or two, but ultimately, they are band-aids. They are not solutions.
Yeah, that's it's in, I was going to say, in our language. So and we had him in actually to speak, Bill Sharp, on the 3 horizons, is what we call horizon 2-, because it basically ends up propping up the old system rather than shift us to where we need to get to. And I guess that's where timelines become really important. You've talked about the next decade or two, and I want to dig into a little bit of both the timeline, but also this both sectoral and broader societal organizational system collapse or breakdown. I kind of talk about, just kind of sort of flippantly to a certain extent, on, well, there is a breakdown coming, and it will be quite big and traumatic, and people nod and say, oh yeah, but they don't really react with the severity with which I think, and I see sort of breakdowns coming through, whether it's in an industry like animal farming or not. And you mentioned kind of the collapse of the extractive core was one of the things that jumped out at me in the book. How are we just not acknowledging how severe that's going to be, or because we need to live with it, because we need to, we can't face it? Or do you think, I guess, that there are ways of avoiding it? Not avoiding that severity, that at least, I'm not sure I see ways around it right now. I'd love you to make me feel slightly more optimistic on that. I have a cousin who's a pig farmer in Denmark, and I talked to him about it, and he's doing lots of things and biodiversifying his feedstocks and blah blah blah, but really we can't keep doing, that industry has got to go to, quite quickly, really. How do we, is there a way around this traumatic breakdown, or is that really where we are?
I mean, in our view, there's an inevitability to existing industrial era industries getting wiped out, and it will happen quickly. And what we've done historically is we've just stumbled into these disruptions, and we've kind of cleared up the mess, actually, if at all, retrospectively, and the people affected and the communities affected get destroyed. I mean, it's just horrific for those involved. And I think we have the ability now to see what's coming, and there's an inevitability that those industries are transformed and wiped out. And we talk about the principle of protecting people and communities and not businesses. And I think that's critical, is finding ways to help those people and those communities that are affected, but not to prop up these industries that are in decline and can't be competitive, which is often the desire. And this is going to be a transformation on a scale we haven't seen. This is not one isolated disruption to one sector. This is across the economy. And I think there are things we can do if we see what's coming to make sure that we navigate our way through. I mean, let's take the food disruption, for instance. So we see over 15, 20 years a very rapid disruption of livestock farming, right? And that affects communities around the world. And it's, it's going to transform how we use land. I mean, 70% or so of the agricultural land is used for livestock farming, and that'll no longer be used, and the communities involved there will no longer have the industries that they've been involved in, or the livelihoods that they've previously had. But most disruptions, you destroy an industry in one location, and the new jobs in the replacement or the disruptive industry are somewhere else, requiring different skills. What we have the possibility of in this we could rewild that land. We could choose to invest in that. So we could, it's exactly the same locations, requiring, somewhat similar skills. And so we could empower the communities who have been, livestock farmers to become stewards of the land and rewild that land, which, there'll be plenty of work over the next decade or two, create even more jobs than are being destroyed, and protect those communities until we get to this sort of, what we call the age of freedom, this world where our material needs are met at very low cost. And so on. But we have to see what's coming. We have to take the right choices, because otherwise it's just going to happen in a kind of unplanned, ad hoc, hugely destructive manner. And so, there are ways in which we can do it. And I'm more and more of the belief that there is some role in government there, to ease the pathway, and to, it will require the old system in some ways to give birth to this new system that we're talking about.
Yeah. I'll bring in two questions or comments. So I think Ran was the person who no, Carrie, isn't the isn't breakdown already here? Number one, are we in the midst of it? And then Ran's question on what are the levers that could be pulled now that would be politically acceptable, that would make the biggest change. So it's that thing of what are the things in the current system that would have a big effect on, I guess, midwifing the next system.
So what was the first question there?
The first was less of it was just, is breakdown not here already? Yeah.
Okay. So breakdown, yes. I mean, I think we can all see the signs, right?
Yeah.
It's there in climate change. It's there in the social sphere. It's there in the technological sphere. It's we can see that with losing some of the cohesion, and often when we come into times of instability, at least that's what we've seen historically. There is this craving for stability. This sort of irony is just as you need kind of adaptability and flexibility.
Everybody,
your ability to adapt disappears. We kind of look backwards for kind of safety and security. And we're seeing that. That's part, I think, of some of the political movements we're seeing, in America and elsewhere. And actually, I think we're seeing it on both sides of the political divide, where we need desperately to encourage conversation and debate and open challenge and skepticism to be able to plot the right path forward. But debate is shut down on both sides of the political divide today, and that really scares me. So yeah, I think absolutely we can see the signs, and we can see the warning signs that we're going to get this horribly wrong. But also some signs, and this is what Green Swans project is all about, is tracking those shoots, those signs of the new emerging. And I think wherever we look, we do see some signs of people completely rethinking how to organize themselves, their organization, their community, their business, and so on. And that's hugely exciting. So that's really important to understand.
And I guess that's, to a certain extent, this is where it comes back to, from my point of view at least, into the mindset. And one of the reasons for the Green Swans tracking and is because it feeds optimism. When you can see that actually things are happening, you are in a better position to not shut the conversations down, to be in that, I guess, space of abundance, or where you can permit others to also be and have different opinions, because you're not feeling under threat all the time and paralyzed.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I think there's real power. It's kind of the North Star effect. Like, we're going to go into this really turbulent decade or two, and it's going to feel really terrifying and really scary. And we need that light at the end of the tunnel. We need to see the kind of the shoots of change and what it is we're striving for. And I don't think we've told anyone, so I'm not talking about us ourselves, but us and others have told a really compelling story about what that future might look like and why we should go. Actually, it's much easier to tell the story of going back, of for instance, cutting use, regenerative farming, going back to a sort of pre-industrial landscape and a pre-industrial farming.
Yes.
I would argue that that can't possibly be a solution. It's too expensive. It's too impactful. It doesn't solve all the other environmental impacts. Actually, what we need to do is go back to a pre-Neolithic landscape. Go back even further and take farming, or livestock farming at least, out of the fields, and that's where we get. So I think that vision of what's possible. I mean, it sounds kind of like a crazy techno utopia right now, and no one's really painted the picture of how incredible and the possibilities that come with a world like that, and that I think is a challenge, because we need that kind of North Star to keep us on track.
And it seems to be, and I'm going to bring in Donna's question from ages ago. Donna, I've been keeping it aside because I thought it was very good, but I wanted to make it at the right time, is this idea of being quite detailed. And Donna said, on a practical level, fast forward 10 years from now, how do you envision day-to-day life in the UK, sort of socially, environmentally, economically? Because surely that's part of telling that story and creating that vision, right? Is what does my day look like differently to now? Am I struggling less if you're one of the many working poor families in the UK, for example?
Yeah. So if we get it right, I mean, I think 20 years from now, we have our needs met largely at extremely low cost, meaning that we might have a right or some new social contract that gives us the right to at least the necessities, food, education, healthcare, transport, shelter, and so on, that we can meet those needs for everyone at a, it's not dissimilar to the concept of a universal basic income, but that is unaffordable in the current model.
Yes.
Right? We just can't afford it at anything like a reasonable level. As time goes by, it'll become increasingly affordable and achievable, and presumably the standard of living will rise over time. And we'll also see much greater automation of the system of production, I think, which I mean, that sounds, it's a very dry phrase when I say it like that, but it basically means that we won't work nearly so much, if at all, in hard physical labor of producing things. Now, there are already a lot of people in what you might call a generative or a creative economy, whether it's writers or musicians or painters or all kinds of different possibilities, and I think as we move, as we have our basic needs met, the question is, what do we then do with our time? How do we provide for if we're provided for, how do we find meaning and purpose and all those things that people can find in their work? And the answer is, well, we continue to do work, or we continue to do activities, but we can pursue whatever activity it is that we desire, and we can follow what really kind of drives us and motivates us, and we find meaning in. And that'll be extremely difficult transition for a huge number of people, I think, and probably absolutely terrifying. But by the time, it's an incredible possibility, and it's the most if we're free essentially from the fear of surviving, that's potentially transformational and all kinds of impact on how we interact,
how we do things, right? And I guess it has been a theme of several of these book clubs, actually, has been this idea of, well, how do we start changing what we value? And most people, and I can see Donna's is adding it. Donna, there's some old book clubs you should listen to as well. This idea that GDP is probably dead on one hand, and how do we put in new systems of measurement, whether it's the well-being economy or others, and then underneath that, on a more personal level, this idea of personal satisfaction, which becomes particularly important, I guess, in the age of freedom, where how do you have, I was going to say, making things and being in a certain flow. I think it was Tim Jackson who described it as flow, on that that gives you what you need as a human being, that's creative. We can't all, I'm assuming, be painters or writers, but we can put time into our garden or doing other things that are quite physical. So it's this interesting thing of, if you take physical labor away, then how do we get rid of that?
Absolutely. And teaching and caring for and creating and so on. And I mean, the possibilities are endless in some respects, and to some that would be paralyzing and terrifying. But I do think it's important to say, I think where we come at it is the other direction from in terms of the language that I was hearing, that this is something that's enabled by what's going on in the production. So these technological transformations create the possibility of having a world that looks like that. And I think that what I hear from a lot of others who are commenting on this sort of domain is that we must do something, that it's a top-down intervention, that we must rework capitalism, or we must have this, or we must do that. And I think the mechanism for change, for me, the only one that can work is that bottom-up emergent process. It's part of the expanding possibility space, and I think that's an important distinction, because for me that top-down mechanism is it's broken unless the possibilities exist, right? And I think we can get very frustrated and very despondent about the lack of change, whilst those possibilities don't exist. But they don't exist today generally. For most people, but they will as we go through time. And I think that's
really interesting. I'm going to give Sophie a warning. Sophie, I'd love to, she doesn't normally talk in these things, but I'd love, before we wrap up at past, for you just to give us, not the second, a bit of a view from the young generation. I think you've got to be the youngest person on the call today, just on how you're seeing that possibility anxiety piece. I'll call on you if that's okay, Soph. Yeah? Okay, she's nodding. Good. I want to just dig in. Susan has put a question up there. I'll read it. I agree we need to see things in terms of the adaptive cycle and healthy collapse and reorganization. You mentioned not propping up industries that are no longer competitive. That sent off a red flag for Susan, as that was the message in the 90s and noughts or zeros, as that was the message, reglobalization and sending low-wage manufacturing jobs offshore, which for the apparel industry led to exponential growth of fast fashion and is extremely ecological and socially unstable. Would love you to clarify how you see that competitiveness and collapse happen.
Yeah. So I mean, where I see us going is to a much more distributed world of manufacturing. So you're right. I mean, we have seen, huge destruction of communities and whole regions as we've seen disruption. I mean, the outsourcing or the offshoring of production has been horrific, both socially and economically. That will come back. I mean, that production will inevitably come back. I mean, we'll have a modularized, largely automated system of production. So the challenge though is as industry after industry gets disrupted, what are we going to do? And there's a false promise to kind of propping up industries through disruption, in that it raises the cost and keeps the benefits away from everyone. You might save some jobs, but everyone pays the price in the form of higher prices and lack of access to the new opportunities. And that sounds kind of somewhat harsh and callous, but as I said, the principle of protecting people and communities and not businesses, I think is a strong one. What we did before was we didn't protect businesses or industries, and we didn't protect people either. And so we just let these things unfold. And I think that's, it's critical that we get that right, that we see what's coming, and we help those communities to rebuild themselves, or not rebuild themselves, but not fall in the first place, find find other ways of participating, making a living, building a community. And I don't have the answer exactly for all of this, but we can't hold back this kind of progress. I mean, it's an unstoppable train, and over time it gets more and more expensive to protect those industries that are at threat of disruption. And so it's really the challenge for all of us across society is, how do we seize the potential? How do we seize the possibilities, the benefits that are opening up? And how do we mitigate or avoid the adverse consequences? And I don't have the answers to that, but what I can say is we need to have our eyes open to the scale of possibilities, both good and bad, so that at least we can begin to plan, because this is, in some ways, unstoppable.
And do you go in and kind of actively push investors to invest in this, or send them the free copies of the book and say, this is where you need to invest in order to accelerate that?
No, I mean, we have a lot of investor interest in our work, but I think it's kind of obvious, I think, to an investor what that means from an investment standpoint. Invest in the new and get out of the old in some ways. I think that's the message, and it it chimes with a lot of what's going on in the climate finance debate. Like, whether it's because there's too much carbon embedded in some of these industries, or whether it's because they're just going to be uncompetitive, doesn't really matter. They're still screwed, essentially. They're still going to be the coal industry, the gasoline car industry, the livestock industry. They're all going to be at threat going forward.
Yeah. And so two things. So do you still think it's unhelpful to focus on the carbon piece of it, and we should just be focusing on competitiveness still? Very simple question, I guess, to a certain extent. And then I want to talk about mindset and communication and language and all that, if we can squeeze that in.
Yeah, so I think it's both and. I mean, in some ways, from my perspective at least, we think X was a reaction to the doom and gloom, right? That we, I mean, I was certainly feeling, 8-9 years ago, that we were just preaching to the converted, right? And kind of just ignoring or alienating anyone else. And doom and gloom is powerful, right? Don't get me wrong. I mean, Greta, for instance, is she's got a lot of attention. She's raised awareness of the issues, and she's creating pressure. And it's, that's important work. But, there is a huge carrot here, and there is a much more optimistic narrative. And fear is can be paralyzing for many people. It's like, what the hell do we do? We're kind of doomed, all these, things I've been told, like switching off my light bulb, kind of don't, have they're never going to save us. What we're saying is, energy is not bad. Energy use, for instance, has been the most incredible thing for, humanity. I mean, we are, across the world have massively better lives than we've ever had before because of energy use. But it's the carbon emissions that comes with energy that's the bad thing. Yeah. And if we can produce energy without any bad impact, then that's great. And so, I think, it's really important to get away, to communicate that message of hope and optimism. The fact that we do have these better tools, these new ways of delivering the same end need without the impact on environment, and that to me is really, really critical. And it's the other side, so it's very much a both and argument. But there are some actions that we talk about doing as a result of the fear and not seeing the possibilities that I think can be potentially hugely destructive. Yes. I think we have to be really careful, and that's my concern. But certainly, as long as we do it rationally and we do it in a way that we need every tool in our arsenal. We need every weapon in our arsenal if we're going to win this fight. And I think we need both the carrot and the stick.
And as you say that, one of the things we've touched on, but I haven't quite got as deep as I wanted to on it, to be honest, is this idea of mindset, and how do you adopt that mindset? And you talk about, as long as we're rational, and you said something that made me very happy when we started, which was this, that actually the model doesn't drive everything, the rationality doesn't drive everything, and it's how do we bring both the rational and then the I guess the other bit of mindset that's helpful, that whether it's intuition or something else, how do we bring those to bear as we go into this? And I always ask people who visit us, what are the actions that this brilliant group of people, should be taking or thinking, but also maybe what is it we should be working against? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And then I will see whether we made Sophie more optimistic or less.
Awesome. Yeah. So mindset, first of all.
Yeah.
I mean, I in my mind, when I think about this, I think of our current kind of paradigm, the current way we tend to think, as really a paradigm of physics, right? Mm-hmm. Simple cause and effect, and somewhat reductive in the way we think. Hugely valuable, right? We can understand the functioning of those pieces, down to the subatomic particle, right? But we also need to add to that, what I term the paradigm of biology, and understand the interconnections and the interactions of the pieces. And I think that's incredibly important. We need to do it across everything, across every domain of human activity, whether it's technology or whether it's any of our social systems or political systems or whatever. And I think that's what's ultimately really missing. And I think if we can bring that that understanding of complexity, that understanding, that holism, to bear, then at least we have a chance of adapting. So that's my answer to the mindset challenge. We can get into. I'm very wary of opening up a kind of a can of worms and ruining everyone's night or going on for far too long here, because we've written about this in some detail, and we talk about this a lot recently. But it's I'm kind of skimming the surface. But I think ultimately that's it. It's physics plus biology rather than physics alone that's gonna help us solve things. That makes sense to me. It might make absolutely no sense.
We can do a poll very quickly. No, that's great. And I didn't want to go much deeper. Now, Adam, I put on the spot very early on and said I was expecting a question for him, and he's coming in just before. So we'll come to you. So, and he says, Adam is one of the people I know who knows most about complex systems. So that's why I wanted him to ask something. And he's saying, agree, the sectors mentioned are going to experience more disruption. However, what about the sectors where costs have increased? Housing, education, medical, and also what role does the financial sector play? Does it not just double down and extract more from the majority for the few?
Wow. Okay.
Big question.
How long have I got? Okay, so the sectors that haven't been disrupted, I mean, I think it's really a problem with our current models and the fact that they haven't been disrupted yet. So, education and healthcare, we expect to be disrupted, and we expect to be disrupted by information technologies largely, which will, lead to a plunging cost. I mean, if we want to continue to deliver education through the same kind of structure and system that we have today, then, there's an inherent cost to that. Right, but there are new models of education, and you might well argue they're far better than our kind of industrial version that we brainwash our children with today. That can deliver an education system and can deliver it in a much more effective manner, which is largely information based. Right, so that we see that as potential, certainly the potential for massive disruption, and that's really exciting because, in parts of the developing world where they don't have a functioning education system, this allows pretty much anyone to access, the best education. And there's no excuse for a bad teacher or, a lack of access to information. Once you have access to information, so there are some preconditions here. Access to communications is one of them. And same in medical. I mean, we see that largely. Some of the same technologies we're seeing in the food space are applicable there, but some of the information technologies, we'd expect the disruption of healthcare to be largely a paradigm shift from what we have today, which is a treatment-based paradigm, into a kind of prevention-based paradigm. So largely we will avoid a need for costly interventions. But again, you know, it requires a change to our organizing system. If we remain in the same kind of intellectual property regimes, then it's going to be hugely expensive still to deliver healthcare. But you know, we'd expect you know, the costs of developing drugs, for instance, now are tumbling. You know, their information costs essentially, you know, they're tumbling, and so there's no need for that kind of IP regime that's really there to encourage investment in what's, you know, really expensive. And we'd expect over the next decade to see us be able to simulate, you know, the impact of drugs on the human body, so at least reduce, you know, those huge costs of drug trials, for instance. And so, you know, we would expect to see a disruption there. You know, finance, God, I mean, you know, same thing. I mean, we're seeing a kind of disintermediation and some form of disruption to finance. But ultimately, if we stick with the same kind of ownership structure, right, that we've had previously, you know, we are going to be screwed. I mean, it is going to be a deeply unequal world, and the benefits will accrue to fewer and fewer people, because, you know, information rules, and information subject to network effects, which are much more powerful than the kind of economies of scale drove competitive advantage in the industrial era. So, you know, that needs to be transformed, and yeah.
Brilliant. No, that's great. Hopefully that satisfied some of it, Adam. Otherwise, drop us a note and we'll tackle it offline. I did just want to check in with Sophie, because Sophie is brilliant and graduated this summer, and we have great conversations around, you know, what her generation, early 20s, believe it or not, what they're feeling when we all say, well, it's going to be, you know, disruptive breakdown over the next decade. Congratulations. So Sophie, I just want to check in with you. How are you? Is this making you feel slightly more optimistic, less, something in between?
I think it's difficult. I oscillate between the two, sort of within a few seconds. I think this conversation in general makes me very optimistic, but then I moved to sort of the more pessimistic outlook where this is really great, but I feel like everyone in this bubble gets it. But when I shut my computer off and I go sort of outside my office, I'm going to encounter so many people who don't get it, and I'm going to come up against resistance. And there's not, that resistance is so natural to a lot of people, and it's so strong and so passionate that we don't have the time to convince them in any really deep way if they're that ingrained that it's something that is against everything they believe in. And I think there really needs to be some way to communicate to people who just don't understand or don't feel like it matters to them or it will affect them what's happening, a way to make it seem like it matters to them and to make them at least understand it, even if they don't necessarily agree with it. Because I think there is a certain gap that it's going to take too long to bridge the way we're currently doing it. And that scares me, because I think I can't speak for my entire generation and I wouldn't pretend to, but I have a lot of views of things I've learned, but people, when I try and tell my friends' parents, they want me to have more expertise than I do. But then the people who have that expertise currently, a lot of them don't have views that things need to change. And by the time I have expertise to back up what I want to say, it's going to be too late. And so it's sort of like, I'm optimistic, but I'm pessimistic and I don't know how to solve it. And
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So that leaves us with about 2 minutes to throw what Sophie just said. I want to throw it over to Jamie, and just for, you know, that thing about we always try to end on, you know, action or something that we can do, so that we don't sit in a bubble and talk amongst ourselves and agree and disagree. And if you haven't looked in the chat, several people, there's some brilliant resources that are being posted and links to articles and all that. We'll share it in the feedback email as well. But I would love, your final reflections, I guess, Jamie, and particularly on, is there something we could do, should do? What should we point people at when we're being like that?
Yeah. So I mean, it's a huge challenge here. So I think partly it's mindset and partly it's a communications challenge. I mean, so far, you know, us and other people involved in this very same discussion have been very bad at telling this story and you know, helping people out. And I think from our perspective, you know, I'm, you know, Tony and me, you know, we're both middle-aged white guys, you know, both somewhat socially awkward, and you know, we're not the right people to be communicating this. And so it's, you know, trying to bring in others who can communicate with different audiences, tell the story better, you know, open eyes, because I think that's you know, that's the first step, is we have to open people's eyes to what's possible and the craziness of some of the stuff we're doing, you know, well-intentioned stuff we're doing. And then it's really to kind of get going. And, you know, but ultimately I think we fail unless, you know, each and every one of us can get comfortable with change. I mean, it's going to be a terrifying decade. And the one thing you know, I have 4 kids, and, you know, the one thing I really hope I can teach them is to be comfortable with change. I think if that's the result of their upbringing, it will stand them in great stead, because we're going to see, you know, change on a scale we've never seen before, and it's going to be deeply unsettling, and it's going to be terrifying in some ways. And I think, you know, literally that you know, that concept of non-attachment is going to be critical. We're going to have to let go of everything that we thought was important and everything that we thought we knew, and just be open to change. And that sounds a lot easier than it is. And so I guess for me, that's, you know, in many ways, the biggest thing we can do is work on ourselves.
Brilliant. That's perfect place to end at 6:32. Thank you. Well, in the UK and other times across the time zones. Thank you, Jamie. I love that. There was so much there. Thank you for just giving us as much as you could in that time. It's making me want to go back to the book again and just check out a few things and infographics.
Yes, thank you. That was great fun, and so I get a bit carried away sometimes when I get going. So thanks for keeping me.
Fantastic. I think everybody would agree.
Thank you, Volans. Well
thank
done.
you, everyone.
Pleasure. Bye.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.